Hello everyone, this is Miss Dean, and welcome to the first installment of our water unit. The first thing we need to look at are the aquatic life zones, and we actually looked at these a little bit when we looked at biomes, but I wanted to review them for you. So first off, when we look at water, we're going to split it into two categories, marine or saltwater and freshwater. And the kind of organisms that can live in different locations is going to be determined by their tolerance to salinity, temperature, how much sunlight they need, the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water, and the nutrients available to them. The big classifications of organisms, the very bottom of the food chain, our most important one is going to be plankton. And there are different types. Phytoplankton, which are photosynthetic, they include things like diatoms and protists, and in some cases we actually add algae to this category, even though algae is not technically a plankton. Phytoplankton are typically eaten by zooplankton. Zooplankton are little animals. They're heterotrophic and include protozoans, larvae, cnidarians, krill, all these little guys here. And occasionally you'll hear someone say the term ultraplankton. Ultraplankton is extremely small, less than 2 micrometers, and usually you're talking about bacteria. Some words you may not be familiar with, we characterize a lot of organisms based on where they live and how they get their food. So we have benthos or benthic organisms. These are bottom dwellers. They usually live on the ocean floor. It might be on a reef, so close to the surface or close to the coast, or it could be deep ocean. Typically they anchor in one spot like a coral, but they may burrow under the ocean or under the sand or walk along the bottom. So you see there's some lobsters and crabs, some corals, mussels, and clams. All of those are considered benthic organisms. Nectonic or nectin organisms are swimmers. They do not follow currents, so they swim wherever their particular feeding paths or mating rituals will take them. So here you can see a couple of different types. We've got the hammerhead shark, a sea turtle, a whale, large fish. These are your big game animals. Typically these are predators, but some, like the sea turtles, can be omnivores. They will eat kelp and seaweed, and they will also eat small fish and jellyfish. When we look at different life zones, remember we don't call aquatic areas biomes, we call them life zones. There are two basic subcategories. We have the coastal areas and the open ocean, and we'll look at those different classifications. When I look at coastal, I'm talking about anything from high tide to the continental shelf. So underneath the ocean is also considered coastal. Here we have very, very high levels of sunlight, so a very high NPP, and almost all marine species live here. 90% of all marine species are going to be found in the coastal areas. The one you're most familiar with is probably the coral reef. This is the most biodiverse area in all of the aquatic life zones. We find thousands of species all living together in very small areas when we look at a coastal reef. They're called the aquatic rainforest. So just like on land, you've got that huge biodiversity in a rainforest, the coral reefs are the same way. Here we have lots and lots of coral polyps. Corals are animals, they are not plants, but they do secrete that calcium carbonate skeleton. And that is what makes them hard on the bottom. It's what keeps them anchored to the ocean floor. Corals are very slow growing and they're very easily disrupted. Their biggest threat right now is sediment runoff. So you can see in these pictures at the top here, these are aerial photos of sediments that are running off from the coast down into the ocean. Here's one, and then here where someone is dumping, and this river underneath is dumping out large quantities of sediment into the water. Our second and this is becoming an even bigger problem. Second problem is bleaching. Bleaching refers to when coral dies and is the only thing left is the white calcium carbonate skeleton. So there's no living organism there anymore. A couple of different reasons that corals will bleach. They actually do have predators that will eat the coral and bleach them. But the biggest problem now is the ocean temperature rise. So even 1 degree temperature increase in the oceans will cause coral to bleach out and die off in very large numbers. And as corals are the foundation of the marine ecosystem, or the coral reef ecosystem, it's extremely dangerous when these corals start to die off. A few other problems: removal. A lot of people will take coral from the reefs, put them in aquariums, and even make them into jewelry. We have, of course, pollution. We'll talk more about water pollution and the types that are damaging to corals later. Damage is surprisingly dangerous to corals. When people go and go scuba diving and look at the corals, a lot of times people will damage them. But anchors from ships and even natural disasters, a massive hurricane or typhoon will come along and break off large pieces of coral and can do a lot of damage. Overfishing is a problem. Usually overfishing is not as huge of a problem at the coral reef, but it can still be, depending on what kind of regulations are in place there. And finally, dynamite fishing or cyanide fishing. This is when people put chemicals into the water or even dynamite into the water, and it kills off a large expanse of organisms. And you can see the stat there that 1 meter squared of reef is killed for every single fish that's caught. So if you think about all the fish that a large commercial fishermen may catch, they're killing off large portions of the reef at the same time. And you can see this is an example of dynamite fishing, and this gentleman is spraying a cyanide poison into the water so that he can catch fish. The intertidal zone is also considered a coastal life zone. Here we're talking about the shoreline between the low and high tide. So sometimes it's underwater and sometimes it's not. Remember back to your basic earth and environmental science that tides are caused by gravitational pull of the moon. We'll talk about that more later. But here, organisms have to be adapted to very harsh conditions because they go back and forth between being underwater and out of the water, and they're very susceptible to predation because they're so exposed. So these organisms are very, very highly adapted. Very important to us, and you can see this is the eastern coast of North Carolina, are barrier islands. These are very small, thin islands that form along the outer part of a continental shelf. These separate us from open water. We generally end up with a sound or bay or lagoon, and you can hear here you can see the Pamlico Sound. So this separation creates huge areas of ecosystem for birds and fish, and it's very protected. So you're not getting all of the waves coming in from the deep ocean. In North Carolina, our barrier islands are very, very important to us, and they protect us actually from hurricanes and other violent storms. Barrier islands, unfortunately, because of the erosion, will shift up and down. And I'm going to go back here. What happens is your waves are going to come in and hit right here, pick up some of the sediment here, and pull it back out to sea. And this happens all up and down the coast. So you're going in this spiral pattern. And the islands down here at the bottom are being eroded away, while the ones up top are being added to. So over time, we end up with a complete shift in the island. This is a jetty, and it's basically a rock barrier that juts out into the ocean and stops all of the erosion from taking the sand away. And it can slow down some of that barrier island erosion. Another thing we can do to help protect these ecosystems is to plant dunes or maintain the dunes that are already there. And here you can see we have, on a barrier island, we have a little salt marsh and a bay, or I'm sorry, the salt marsh is right here. My bay is right there, and then I have a nice big sand dune where I grow special grasses, and lots of specialized birds and plants will live there. Dunes definitely hold everything in place, and they provide a lot of protection from natural disasters, so we want to protect those. One of the most productive areas that we'll see and most important areas we'll see are the coastal wetlands. These include the inlets, bays, sounds, and here the mangrove forest. Mangrove forests are all over the world. We have cypress forests in North Carolina and South Carolina that have the same kind of structure with these big trees that can live in brackish water. And these areas are so important to us because they serve as homelands or nesting lands for hundreds of thousands of species of birds. So these birds are able to nest here and live and raise their chicks. We also have, these are areas where fish will come in and lay eggs. They're very, very productive, lots of nutrients, plenty of solar energy, and quite a bit, obviously, of water. So they're very productive. And our last coastal area is the estuary. An estuary is where freshwater and saltwater meet. So this is at the mouth of a river. This is on the west coast, let's see here, the Columbia River coming out into the Pacific Ocean. And all of this water here, when I have all this fresh water come out and meet with the salt water, I end up with a kind of brackish water. And brackish is kind of not quite fresh or salt. And there are dozens of species that are adapted to living only in these areas. So they're very important to protect. This is also where we have a lot of runoff problems. And we have nutrient pollution when I have all that excess nitrogen and potassium, or yes, nitrogen and potassium coming off agricultural land and into our estuaries. This is a map and picture of the Chesapeake Bay area, which is a very important estuary to us. Finally, we have the open ocean. So I come back to our original here, and I want you to look at this picture so you can see already just on the picture the differences between our zones. When I look at open ocean zones, I'm really looking at a difference in sunlight and temperature. Those are the two biggest things you're going to see. So the euphotic zone is the one on top. This is where we have lots of sunlight. The phytoplankton gives us a ton of photosynthesis. So we have a high DO, which is dissolved oxygen. And we also, there's very low carbon dioxide. Here we have lots of big fish. That's where our mammals live. So the whales, sea lions. We also see some turtles will come up here and live. It's very, very important to us. This is where most of the biodiversity happens. The second level is the middle zone, and it's called the bathyl zone. This area is dimly lit. There are some producers, but really not many, but we do find a lot of zooplankton and smaller fish. So the zooplankton can filter up and feed, and then the smaller fish will kind of dart back and forth between the euphotic and the bathyl. But these are open swimmers, not nearly as many fish in this area, but the ones that are there are still very important to us. The last zone that's important to us is the abyssal zone, and this is the bottom layer. The abyssal zone is what we know the least about. It's very dark, extremely cold, almost no dissolved oxygen. There's high levels of carbon dioxide here, and the nutrients from the ocean will filter onto the ocean floor. We have a lot of scavengers here. This is where, when a whale dies, it falls to the bottom of the ocean, and scavengers in the abyssal zone will eat all of that dead material. We also have some producers. They are not photosynthetic. The only producers that can live here, because there is no light, are chemosynthetic bacteria, and usually we find those at hydrothermal vents. This is a lovely picture of some hydrothermal vents. Hopefully you've seen these before, but they come in two different categories. We have black smokers and white smokers, but each one is an example of what happens when ultra-heated water and gas from the ocean floor, or from underneath the crust, heated by the magma, enters the rock zone. So here I have all this ultra-heated material coming up from the magma underneath the crust. It's heating all of the water and all this gas, and then it escapes as a little vent. It's almost like a geyser underwater. These are continuous though, unlike a geyser which builds up pressure and then releases. These run all the time. These are some different organisms that live in the benthic zone. Again, this is a lot less, we know a lot less about these, but they are very important to us. And these are tube worms that live on the vents themselves. So a little crustacean, a little crab, an octopus, which like it in the deep dark. And I want you to look at the colors of these guys. Most deep water organisms are going to be either completely void of color, so white or clear, or red. And it's kind of counterintuitive. Why would you have this bright red organism living at the bottom of the ocean? The reason for that is, I guess I'll go back. The reason for that is the red color almost disappears. Under the low light conditions that are under, in this deep abyssal zone, we really can't see the color red. So organisms that are red are almost invisible. So you will see quite a few organisms turn this color, or that have evolved to be this color. Either that or, like I said, completely devoid of color. And this is just a picture to show you deep, deep underwater in the abyssal zone. We do have lots of rock. There's a lot of bacteria and zooplankton and little tiny crustaceans growing on this rock. And then you've got these little white crabs that go along and feed on whatever they can find down here. So very low productivity, but they're still extremely important to us. We discover new species in the abyssal zone every year because it is so hard to get to. The pressure, the cold, the lack of light,